The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and by Thursday, Winifred Prescott had packed every book she owned, sharpened 6 pencils, and boarded a westbound train that smelled of coal smoke and ambition. She was 26 years old, unmarried by choice and not by accident, and she had spent the last 4 years working as a botanical illustrator and field cataloger for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. She had catalogued orchids in Georgia, mapped fern varieties along the Appalachian ridgeline, and produced 47 detailed ink drawings of native grasses from Virginia to the Ohio Valley. She was precise, thorough, and deeply serious about her work in a way that made certain men deeply uncomfortable and certain women deeply envious. The assignment that had arrived on that Tuesday morning was, by any measure, the most significant of her career. The United States Geological Survey, in coordination with the Department of the Interior, had commissioned a comprehensive botanical and ecological survey of the Colorado Territory, specifically the western slope of the San Juan Mountains and the river valleys that fed into the Gunnison. The territory was vast, largely unmapped in any botanical sense, and considered by most of her male colleagues to be entirely too rugged for a woman of refined sensibilities. Winifred had read that portion of the accompanying letter from her supervisor, Dr. Emmett Hale, with a very particular set of narrowed eyes, and then she had written back a response of exactly 2 sentences. "I accept the assignment with gratitude. Please ensure my field kit is expanded to include a secondary specimen press and an additional roll of drafting linen." She was not going to argue about whether she was capable. She was simply going to go. The train carried her west through Missouri, then into Kansas, and eventually into Colorado Territory by way of Denver. Denver was loud and dusty and full of men in a hurry, and Winifred found it overwhelming in the way that cities built too quickly always were, all ambition and no patience. She stayed one night at a boarding house on Larimer Street, ate a meal of salted beef and beans that she found adequate, and the next morning hired a supply wagon heading south toward Gunnison. The driver of the wagon was a weathered man named Cornelius Fitch, who had the disposition of a man who had been arguing with mules for so long that he had begun to think like one. He spoke very little on the 2-day ride south, which suited Winifred perfectly. She sat on the wagon bench with her field journal open on her knee and sketched everything she could see from the road, the way the grassland gradually gave way to scrub oak, the scrub oak to ponderosa pine, the ponderosa pine to the great reaching fingers of aspen and spruce as the altitude climbed. The mountains rose ahead of her like a wall made of something more permanent than stone, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely small in the most wonderful possible way. They arrived in the town of Gunnison on a Friday afternoon in late April. The town was newer than it looked, which was the defining characteristic of most Colorado towns in that era, buildings thrown up fast and painted to suggest permanence they had not yet earned. There was a general store, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a land office, a church still being framed, and a hotel called the Pioneer House that offered rooms with actual beds and a dining room that served 3 meals a day, which Winifred considered a very satisfactory base of operations. She checked in, arranged for her equipment trunks to be brought upstairs, and spent her first evening in Gunnison organizing her specimen jars, cleaning her magnifying glass, and spreading the inadequate government maps across the small desk by the window. The maps were, as she had expected, largely useless for her purposes. They showed rivers and elevation contour lines, but nothing botanical, nothing ecological, nothing that told her where the meadows lay at altitude or where the riparian corridors were richest with plant life. She was going to have to build those maps herself. She went down to the dining room the next morning for breakfast and introduced herself to the hotel proprietor, a Mrs. Agnes Dole, who was a stout and efficient woman with silver hair wound tight as a watch spring. When Winifred explained her purpose, Mrs. Dole looked at her with the particular expression that Winifred had learned to read as a mixture of respect and concern. "You are talking about going up into those mountains," Mrs. Dole said, setting down a plate of eggs. "That is precisely what I am talking about," Winifred agreed. "Alone, with a guide, I hope. I was told in Denver that there might be someone in Gunnison who knew the high country well enough to serve as a field guide for my survey work." Mrs. Dole was quiet for a moment, refilling Winifred's coffee cup with the focused energy of a woman choosing her words. "There's a man," she said at last. "Seth Lockhart. He's a trapper mostly. Runs his lines up in the San Juans every winter, knows that country better than anyone still living who's willing to talk about it. He comes into town every few weeks for supplies. He was here just last Tuesday, so you might have to wait." Winifred took out her field journal and wrote the name down. "Seth Lockhart. Do you know where I might send word to him?" Mrs. Dole's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but contained the possibility of one. "He doesn't receive correspondence, Miss Prescott. He lives up on a ridge above the Tamichi Creek Valley. No address. You either wait for him to come to town or you ride out and hope you find him." Winifred looked at her journal, looked at the inadequate maps, looked at the mountains visible through the dining room window, blue-gray and enormous in the morning light, and made her decision immediately. "I will ride out and find him," she said. The following Tuesday, having spent the intervening days at the hotel conducting interviews with local residents and sketching the plant life along the Gunnison River for the preliminary section of her report, Winifred hired a horse from the livery, a steady brown mare named Bessie by the stable hand, and renamed Prudence by Winifred on the grounds that Bessie was not a dignified name for a working animal, and set out northeast along a track that a weathered rancher named Mr. Holbrook had described as roughly following Tamichi Creek toward the higher country. The ride was beautiful and somewhat terrifying in the way that beautiful things often are when there is no fence between you and them. The creek ran clear and cold alongside the track, and the willows along its banks were just beginning to bud, small green explosions against the dull winter stems. The ponderosa pines grew thicker as she climbed, and then gave way to spruce and fir, and by mid-afternoon she was high enough that patches of snow still lay in the north-facing hollows beneath the trees, hard and crystalline and blue-shadowed. She almost missed the cabin entirely. It was set back from the creek on a small rise, built of notched logs with a sod roof that had begun to show the green tufts of early grass, and it blended into the hillside behind it so completely that Winifred was nearly past it when she caught the smell of wood smoke, and then, a moment later, saw the figure standing at the edge of the tree line to her left. He was watching her. She pulled Prudence to a stop and sat very straight in the saddle, which was her instinctive posture when she was startled, and did not want to appear so. The man was perhaps 30 feet away, standing at the boundary between the open ground and the forest shadow as if he belonged to both and neither. He was very tall, easily 6 feet, and perhaps an inch or two beyond that, with shoulders that looked as though they had been designed for bearing weight, broad and sloping with muscle. His arms, crossed loosely over his chest, were thick with it, the kind of muscle that came from years of actual labor rather than any deliberate cultivation. His hair was dark, nearly black, and fell past his collar in a way that suggested it had not been cut since some time the previous autumn. His jaw was heavy with several days of beard, and his eyes, even at this distance, were the particular gray of river water just before a storm. He was wearing buckskin trousers, a heavy flannel shirt the color of pine bark, and boots that had seen considerable use. He carried no weapon that Winifred could see, which she found either reassuring or alarming depending on what it meant about his confidence in his own ability to handle whatever came his way. "Seth Lockhart," she called. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Who's asking?" His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not speak often and therefore chose his words with the same care one might give to the placement of stones crossing a fast river. "My name is Winifred Prescott," she said, reaching into the saddlebag at her knee and producing the letter bearing the Smithsonian seal. "I'm a botanical surveyor working on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution and the United States Geological Survey. I need a guide who knows the high country of the San Juan Range, and I was told in Gunnison that you are the best qualified man for the work." He looked at her for another moment without moving. Then he uncrossed his arms and walked toward her, unhurried, with the ground-covering stride of a man accustomed to covering distance on foot. Up close, he was, if anything, more imposing than he had appeared from 30 feet. He was solidly made through the chest and arms in the way of men who spent their lives in physical contest with the wilderness, the kind of build that spoke of chopping wood and setting traps and hauling game through deep snow. He reached up and took the letter from her hand without ceremony, unfolded it, and read it. She watched him read. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one, his gray eyes moving deliberately down the page. He had good hands, she noticed, large and scarred across the knuckles, with the particular roughness of skin that spent most of its time exposed to wind and cold. He refolded the letter and handed it back to her. "You want to go into the high country and make drawings of plants," he said. It was not quite a question. "And collect specimens," Winifred said, "and make field notes. I need to catalog the botanical diversity of the western slope of the San Juan Range, including the alpine meadows, the riparian zones, and the transitional forest communities between the montane and subalpine zones. The survey will run through the end of June, possibly into early July. The government will pay you $30 a month and provide your food and any supplies you need." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she had the distinct impression that he was not assessing her competence in the way her male colleagues in Washington sometimes did, with that particular sideways calculation that asked whether she could be trusted to think properly. He was looking at her the way he had probably looked at weather fronts and river crossings his entire life, directly and practically, assessing the actual conditions in front of him. "When do you want to start?" he asked. "Monday," she said, "if that suits you." "It suits," he said, and then, after a beat, as if this were a significant concession of hospitality, "You want to come in out of the afternoon sun?" "I've got coffee on." Winifred looked at the sun, which was, in fact, still well clear of the western peaks and causing her no particular distress, and then she looked at the cabin, and then she looked at Seth Lockhart and said, "Yes, thank you." The inside of the cabin was not what she had expected, which was her first indication that Seth Lockhart was going to be a more complicated subject of study than she had anticipated. She had expected dirt floors, a rough table, the general atmosphere of a man living in deliberate isolation from civilization. What she found instead was a single clean room with plank floors worn smooth, a wide stone fireplace built by someone who understood how heat moved, shelves on every wall holding a mixture of practical items, canteens, coils of rope, tin containers of various sizes, and books. A surprising number of books. She saw, at a quick scan, titles on natural history, geology, the journals of John Muir, a battered copy of Darwin, and several volumes she could not read the spines of from where she stood. He poured coffee from a pot on the stove into 2 tin cups without asking how she took it, and she accepted hers and drank it black because she had a feeling it would be some time before milk was available. "You've been up here alone all winter?" she asked, because it was the question that wanted asking. "Since October," he said. He had settled into a chair near the fire with the ease of a man in his own place, but he sat with his back straight, not sprawled, as if some fundamental self-possession would not allow him to fully relax in company. "Came down twice for supplies, once in January, once 3 weeks ago. Do you not find it isolating?" He considered this. "I find it quiet," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at his books. "I see you have Darwin's On the Origin of Species." He followed her glance. "I do. And Muir. Do you share his view of the mountains as a kind of cathedral? Something shifted in his expression, subtle as a change in light but visible if you were paying attention. I think the mountains are mountains, he said. They don't need to be anything else to be worth respecting. It was, she thought, a more interesting answer than Muir's own in some ways. She rode back down to Gunnison in the long, golden light of late afternoon, and she spent Sunday preparing her equipment for the survey. And Monday morning at first light, she rode back up the Tamichi Creek track with 2 pack mules hired from Mr. Holbrook, and her full field kit distributed between them. Seth Lockhart was waiting at the edge of the clearing when she arrived, his own horse already saddled, a big dark bay gelding that looked as though it shared its owner's opinion on ornamentation, that being that there should be none. He had a pack horse of his own loaded with camping equipment, and he looked at her mules and her trunks with the particular measured expression of a man who had been expecting excess and was deciding how to handle it. The specimen press is the heaviest piece, she said, preempting him. It needs to come with us. Everything else is negotiable. The press stays, he agreed. What's in the third trunk? Books and drafting materials. He looked at her. 1 book, she said. And the drafting materials, which are essential. They reached an arrangement, and they set out. The first weeks of the survey were a kind of mutual education. Seth Lockhart knew the San Juan high country with the intimate, practical knowledge of a man who had been moving through it for nearly a decade, since coming west from Kentucky at the age of 22, following a life there that he spoke of rarely and without sentiment. He knew where the springs were, which slopes were prone to late-season avalanche, where the deer and elk came to graze the high meadows, which creek crossings ran gentle and which ran treacherous with snowmelt. He knew the country the way Winifred knew the taxonomic classification of a plant family, from the inside out, with the particular confidence of knowledge earned through experience rather than study. What he did not know, and what quickly became apparent, was that he had been looking at the plant life around him his entire life without a systematic framework for understanding what he was seeing. He knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which barks could be used medicinally, which grasses the horses preferred. But he had never considered that the particular composition of plants on a south-facing slope versus a north-facing slope told a story about soil moisture and solar radiation and ecological succession. He had never thought about the fact that the way a meadow transitioned from grass to willow scrub to spruce forest along an elevational gradient represented a predictable and documentable pattern that repeated itself throughout the range. When Winifred explained these things, kneeling in the first alpine meadow they reached above treeline, her hand moving across the grass to indicate the tiny flowering plants mixed in among the stems, she watched Seth Lockhart process what she was saying with the focused attention of a man encountering something genuinely new. He crouched beside her, those big hands resting on his knees, and looked at what she was looking at, and she could see, quite clearly, the moment the framework clicked into place for him, when the meadow stopped being background and became a text. So you can tell from what's growing here what the winter snowpack was like, he asked. I can make reasonable inferences, she said. These sedge communities suggest prolonged snow cover. The forbs coming in along the southern edge, there suggest the snow melts off that section first, which means it's probably the sunniest, warmest microclimate in this meadow. And those cushion plants on the exposed rock outcrops are some of the most specialized alpine plants in North America, almost perfectly adapted to the most extreme conditions this environment offers. Look. She moved to the outcrop and knelt over a plant the size of her palm, a tight, compact rosette of small leaves, flowering with tiny white blossoms. He came and crouched beside her, close enough that she was aware of his warmth against the thin, cold air of altitude. That's been there the whole time I've been working this country, he said quietly. I stepped over it 1,000 times. Most people do, she said. It is not dramatic. It's small because it has to be small, he said, almost to himself. The wind up here. Exactly, she said, and she looked up and found him already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She looked back at the plant and opened her journal. They made camp each night in the places Seth chose, always with the particular skill of a man who had spent years learning which spots were sheltered from which winds, where the ground was dry, how far from water to camp to avoid drawing predators, how to build a fire that threw heat without drawing attention. He set up his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire from hers and spoke very little in the evenings, but it was a companionable silence rather than an empty one, the kind of quiet that two people who are comfortable with each other inhabit together. He cooked, which surprised her. He cooked well, which surprised her more. He made elk stew with dried herbs from a tin in his pack, and cornbread in a cast-iron skillet set near the coals, and once memorably, a trout he caught with casual expertise from a high-altitude lake where the water was so clear it looked like air, which he prepared with butter and wild onions that Winifred had catalogued that same afternoon as allium jayeri, wild onion, and which Seth had pointed out to her with the observation that they were very good eating. A statement she had recorded in her field notes as local use, culinary. She found herself looking forward to the evenings in a way that she had not anticipated and could not entirely account for. They had been in the field for 3 weeks when the first significant thing happened between them. They were crossing a high pass, above 12,000 feet, on a cold morning in mid-May when the weather turned with the sudden, absolute indifference that high-altitude weather reserves for the moments when you most need it to remain cooperative. The sky, which had been the depthless blue that is specific to altitude, developed a line of gray in the northwest that Seth spotted from half a mile below the pass. "We need to move," he said, and the flatness in his voice was its own kind of urgency. They moved, but the storm moved faster. By the time they reached the pass, the wind had come up to something beyond unpleasant, and the first hard pellets of sleet were coming horizontal across the exposed saddle of rock. The pack animals were pulling against their leads, ears flat. Winifred's horse, Prudence, was holding steady with the particular grim stoicism of a horse that had earned its name. Seth was off his horse and moving toward her before she fully understood the situation had changed. "Off the horse," he said, reaching up for her arm. "We need to get below tree line on the south side before this gets worse. Can you move fast?" "I can move fast," she said, and she was off Prudence and beside him, taking the lead rope he handed her. They went down the south side of the pass at a pace that was not quite running but not far from it, and when the sleet became snow, genuine snow falling thick and sideways in the wind, they had just reached the first scattered trees and Seth was already moving toward an outcrop of rock that she would not have identified as shelter, but which, under his direction, turned out to have a lee side that broke the wind to something bearable and a natural overhang that the thickest snow could not reach. He tied all 4 animals to a nearby spruce with practiced speed and then turned to her with a look that she interpreted as an assessment of how she was holding up. She was cold. She was wet along her shoulders and across her hat brim. She was breathing hard from the descent, but she was not frightened, and she met his look steadily enough that he seemed to accept this as information. "It'll blow through in a couple of hours," he said. "Early season storms up here don't usually sit." "Then we wait," she said. He unpacked a blanket from his own pack, a heavy wool one that smelled of wood smoke and cold, and handed it to her without ceremony. She put it around her shoulders. He sat against the rock face beside her, close enough that the bulk of him blocked the wind that curled around the edge of the overhang, and she was aware of the solid warmth of his arm against hers and chose not to move away from it. The storm blew in sheets across the pass above them, and the horses stamped and blew, and the trees bent, and they sat together against the rock and waited. "Have you been in worse?" she asked, partly to have something to say and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "January," he said, 3 winters ago, got caught above tree line on the north face of Uncompahgre in a blizzard that lasted 2 days, built a snow shelter and waited. 2 days, she said. "I had a book," he said, and she heard something in his voice that she thought might have been the distant ancestor of humor, so dry and understated that it was almost invisible. She laughed, and it surprised her, the realness of it. "Which book?" He was quiet for a beat. "Darwin," he said. She laughed again, and this time she was almost certain he smiled, a small, private thing that appeared and disappeared in the corner of his mouth. The storm blew through in an hour and 40 minutes, which Winifred noted in her field journal because she was constitutionally incapable of not noting things down. And when the sky cleared, it did so completely and brilliantly, the way high-altitude sky does, as if the storm had been a curtain pulled back to reveal something more real behind it. The snow on the ground around them was 3 inches deep and sparkling, and the peaks above the pass were white and hard-edged against the renewed blue. Seth stood and shook the snow off his hat and looked at the sky with the detached, expert eye of a man reading a language in which he was fully fluent. "We'll get another hour of good light if we move now," he said. "Then we should move," she agreed, and they repacked and remounted and continued south across the pass, which was beautiful and brutal, and exactly the kind of country that Winifred had come here to understand. Something had shifted between them in the lee of that rock face, something small and imprecise that she could not have put in her field journal, but that she was aware of nonetheless. They descended into a valley she had not yet catalogued and made camp in a grove of aspen at its lower end, where a small creek fed into a larger one, and the grass was just coming green along the banks. Seth made a fire while Winifred set up her specimen press and carefully arranged the afternoon samples, sedges and early flowering forbs and a small orchid she had found near a spring seep that she was almost certain was a species not previously recorded from this drainage. "Platanthera," she said aloud, bent over her notes, "possibly a new record for this elevation." "Is that significant?" Seth asked from across the fire where he was setting the pot to heat. "It could be very significant," she said. She looked up at him. "Finding a plant species at a new locality, at a new elevation, extends our understanding of its range and its ecological tolerances. It tells us something about what's possible, about the flexibility of life." He looked at her across the fire with those gray stormwater eyes for a moment. "The flexibility of life," he repeated, as if tasting the phrase. "Does that sound overly romantic for a scientific observation?" she asked, a little defensive. "No," he said. "It sounds accurate." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly called for by the conversation, and then she looked back at her notes. But the page was harder to focus on than usual. The survey moved through the high country as May deepened into June, and the world at altitude transformed around them with the particular urgent generosity of places that have a short growing season and no time for hesitation. The snow retreated up the peaks daily, uncovering new ground, and on the newly exposed soil, the first plants appeared with a speed that seemed almost willful, as if they had been waiting all winter for exactly this moment. Winifred was cataloging faster than she had ever worked in her life, filling pages of her field journal, exhausting roll after roll of drafting linen with her botanical illustrations, labeling specimen after specimen, and carefully pressing them between the absorbent papers of her field press. Seth watched her work. She became aware of this gradually, the way one becomes aware of a change in the light, not all at once but in accumulation. He would find reasons to be nearby when she was drawing, or he would bring her a plant he had found while checking the horses and hold it out for her inspection without preamble, the way a person offers something valuable. "Found this on the north side of that outcrop," he said one afternoon, holding out a small plant with dark, kidney-shaped leaves and tiny white flowers. She took it carefully and brought it close to examine. "Micrans," she said. "Saxifrage, where exactly? Show me on the map." He came to sit beside her at the camp table she had rigged from a board and 2 stumps, and he bent over the map and put his finger on a point along the northern face of the outcrop, and she leaned in to see, and for a moment his shoulder was against hers and she could smell the outdoor smell of him, wood smoke and spruce resin and something that was simply cold, clean air, and she had to make a deliberate effort to focus on the map. "Here?" she asked, pointing. "A few yards up from there," he said. in a crack in the rock where there was still a little melt water coming through. "That is perfect," she said, and she meant the location, but she was not entirely sure whether the word applied only to the location. It was on a Wednesday evening, with perhaps 3 weeks of the survey remaining, that the thing that had been building between them with the slow inevitability of a river finding its way downhill finally broke the surface. They had made camp beside a lake at 11,000 feet, one of those high-altitude lakes that has no particular name on any map, but that deserves one, clear and cold, and circled by Krumholtz spruce bent by decades of wind into permanent submission. The evening was warm for the altitude, the air still for once, and the sky at sunset was doing something extraordinary with orange and pink that reflected in the lake's surface, until the water and the sky seemed to be having a conversation. Winifred had closed her field journal. This was notable because she did not generally close her field journal until it was genuinely too dark to see. Seth was sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge, elbows on his knees looking at the sunset, and she walked over and sat beside him, not at the formal camp table distance she usually maintained, but at the straightforward human distance of two people who have spent 2 months in close company and have stopped pretending that the company is merely professional. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked at her. "You can ask. Why did you stay up here, after the first winter? What made you come back and keep coming back?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the lake. The reflected sky was deepening toward red. "I came west because I needed to leave Kentucky," he said at last, with the flatness of a man closing a door on a room he has already emptied. "I had a brother who drank badly, and a situation that had gone wrong in ways I didn't want to repeat, and I needed distance and altitude and quiet. I spent that first winter up here because it was the cheapest way to survive, trapping and trading furs. And then one morning in February, I came out of the cabin before dawn and the sky was the most absolute black I had ever seen, and every star was so clear I felt like I could have touched them, and there was not a sound in the world, and I understood something I couldn't have put into words then." "What did you understand?" she asked quietly. "That I was exactly where I was supposed to be," he said. "Not where I had planned to be, not where anyone would have expected me to be, just where I was supposed to be." He paused. "I haven't had many experiences of that. I value it." She was looking at his profile against the darkening sky, the line of his jaw, the way the last light caught in the darkness of his hair. "I understand that," she said. "I came to this work because it was the only work that felt necessary to me in the way that other people described faith feeling necessary, as if without it I would be arranged incorrectly." She paused. "My family thought I was being stubborn, that I should have married and let science be a hobby." "Were they wrong?" he asked, and there was something careful in the question, something that was asking more than it was saying. "About science being a hobby, yes," she said. "About the rest of it," she looked at the lake. "I don't think I was wrong not to marry anyone I had been given to consider, but I don't think the institution itself is wrong." The silence after that statement was very full. Seth looked at her, and she looked at him, and the sunset continued its business in the sky above them. And there was a moment, genuine and weighted, in which the space between them felt like a question that had been building for weeks, and that both of them had finally stopped pretending was not there. It was Winifred who moved first, not toward him, but in turning to face him more fully, which in the narrowness of the rock they were sharing meant that the gap between them was perhaps a foot, and she held his gaze with a directness that was her defining characteristic in every situation. "Seth," she said, and then did not immediately say anything after that because she was not entirely sure what should come next. He reached out and with a careful deliberateness that was entirely consistent with everything she knew about how he operated in the world, he took her hand from where it rested on her knee. His hand was large and warm and rough-palmed, and he held hers without squeezing, just holding as if establishing the fact of it. "I know you're leaving in July," he said. "I know that too," she said. He looked at their joined hands and then at her. "I don't know what to do with that information." "Neither do I," she said honestly. "But I know that not acknowledging the situation between us is not a solution to it." He looked at her with something in his face that was very close to the expression she had seen when he looked at the plant cushion on the alpine rock, the recognition of something he had been walking past without seeing. "Winifred," he said, and the way he said her name, fully and without diminishment, was different from any way she had heard it said before. "I am not practiced at this." "I don't need you to be practiced at it," she said. "I need you to be honest." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, slowly and with the care of a man placing each stone to cross a fast river, "I think about you when you're on the other side of the camp. I think about what you're writing in that journal. I wonder what you'll do when you get back to Washington. I wonder what it would be like if you didn't go." He stopped. "That is all very impractical." "Yes," she agreed, her heart doing something in her chest that she would have described in a field note as elevated and irregular rhythm. "It is very impractical. But it's true," he said. "Yes," she said, "and for what it's worth, the wondering goes in both directions." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then, with the same careful deliberateness with which he had taken her hand, he leaned forward and kissed her, gently and briefly, and the gentleness of it was not what she had expected from such a large, solid man, and it undid her more completely than force would have. When they separated, the lake was perfectly still and perfectly dark, and the first stars were appearing, and they sat together on the flat rock with their hands still joined, and did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying in that particular moment that was not already entirely clear. What was less clear was what came next, and they both knew it, and they did not pretend otherwise. They talked that night long past the point at which they usually banked the fire and turned in. They talked about the practical reality of what was between them and what the survey's end would mean. Winifred had a position in Washington. She had a report to write, a collection of specimens to catalog and deposit at the Smithsonian, illustrations to complete and submit. She had a career that she had built with extraordinary effort against considerable resistance, and that she was not willing to simply abandon. Seth had his cabin and his trapping lines and his winter route through the high country, and Washington, D.C. was as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. "I'm not asking you to come to Washington," she said carefully, watching the fire. "I know," he said, "and I'm not saying I can stay here. I know that too." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight." She looked at him across the fire. This man who had become in 2 months so necessary to her understanding of where she was in the world that she could not quite imagine removing him from the picture, and having the picture remain coherent. "What I am saying," she said, "is that what I feel is real, and I am not going to pretend it is not, or pretend that the practicalities make it irrelevant." "Good," he said, simply and without elaboration, and somehow the simplicity of it was exactly right. The last 3 weeks of the survey were different from the first 2 months. Not in the work, which continued with the same rigorous pace, Winifred cataloging and drawing and noting and pressing, Seth guiding and finding and pointing, and increasingly contributing observations of his own that she incorporated into her field notes with full attribution. Observed by S. Lockhart at this location, because they were valuable and they were his. The difference was in the texture of the time between the work, the evenings and the mornings, and the hours on horseback when they talked in a way that had moved past the professional and past the cautious and into something that felt very much like two people learning each other in the fundamental way. She learned that he had grown up partly in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the son of a man who worked a hardscrabble farm and read the Bible and said very little else, and a mother who had died when Seth was 11, and whom he had mourned quietly and completely for his entire subsequent life. She learned that the brother who drank was the older of two, and that Seth had left Kentucky partly because he could not watch what was happening and could not stop it, and that the guilt of leaving was something he had worked through in the particular way of people who do their emotional labor in solitude, slowly and thoroughly over years. He learned that she had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a university professor of classical languages, who had applied to his only child the same serious and unsentimental educational standards he applied to his students, which meant that Winifred could read Latin and Greek and had been reading natural history texts since she was 9. He learned that her mother had thought she was strange and difficult, and had said so with a regularity that had ceased to hurt at some point and simply become background noise. He learned that she had a colleague and friend named Margaret Astor, who was the only person in Washington who consistently treated her as a peer rather than an anomaly, and that she wrote Margaret long letters about the survey that she had not yet written, because the survey had become so much more than she had expected and she was not sure how to begin. "What would you say in those letters?" Seth asked one morning, when they were riding through a high meadow and she had been quiet for some time. She considered this. "I would say that the San Juan high country is the most botanically rich terrain I have ever worked in," she said. "I would say that the survey has gone beyond anything I expected in terms of discovery. I would say that I have made a significant find in terms of the orchid distribution records." She paused. "And I would say that I have discovered that the category of mountain man as a cultural type is significantly more various and interesting than the literature suggests." He looked at her sideways. "The literature. The category has been much written about," she said, entirely straight-faced, "mostly by people who have not met any." He made a sound that, from Seth Lockhart, was the equivalent of a laugh. It was the kind of sound that made her feel she had won something. The last day of the survey proper came in the first week of July, when they descended from the high country with the fully loaded pack animals and Winifred's collected specimens, and completed notebooks and rolled illustrations. And she could feel the summer heat of the lower elevations settling back onto her skin after the altitude cold. And something in her chest was doing something that she could not catalog, because it did not have a name in any of her reference texts. They made camp that final night in the aspen grove at the mouth of the valley where they had camped on the second night of the survey, as if ending where they had nearly begun. And Seth made elk stew one more time, and she sat across the fire from him and looked at him and thought about all the ways this had not gone as she had planned, and how grateful she was that plans were not always what happened. "I need to go back to Gunnison tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "Seth." She stopped. He looked at her, those gray eyes steady and direct as they always were. "I don't want to leave in the way that means the ending of this," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then what kind of leaving do you want it to be?" She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, which was not her usual turnaround time for a major decision, but which, under the circumstances, felt adequate. "I have to go back to Washington," she said. "The specimens have to be deposited, the report has to be written. There are obligations I cannot simply walk away from. That will take at minimum through the winter. Possibly longer." He nodded, listening. "But the Geological Survey," she said, "is planning a second round of Western surveys next spring. The botanical component of the Colorado Territory work is only half done. There is the eastern slope of the range and the plateau country to the west and the Dolores River drainage. All of it needs cataloging. I would be a natural choice to continue the work." He was very still, watching her. "And if I were to come back," she said, "I would need a guide who knows the country." The silence stretched out across the firelight. "Winifred," he said at last, and his voice had a quality in it that she had not heard before, something that was not quite rough and not quite broken, but that was absolutely honest in the way of things that have been held a long time and are finally being set down carefully in the open air. "If you're asking whether I'd be here, I'd be here." "I'm asking," she said. "Then yes," he said, "I'd be here." They looked at each other across the fire, and it was both insufficient and entirely sufficient at the same time, the way real commitments sometimes are, not dramatic enough for their actual weight but carrying it nonetheless. She went to Washington. She rode back to Gunnison the next morning and said goodbye to Mrs. Dole at the Pioneer House, who looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had seen several things in Winifred's face over the summer and had put them together correctly. "Will you be back, Miss Prescott?" she asked. "Yes," Winifred said. "In the spring." She took the supply wagon back to Denver and the train back east, and the train moved her through the landscape in reverse, the mountains giving way to the plateau to the high plains to the grasslands of Kansas and Missouri, and eventually to the flat certainty of the East. And she sat with her field journals on her lap, and her specimen boxes carefully stowed in the baggage car, and thought about Seth Lockhart with the particular precision she brought to all of her thinking, which was to say, without sentimentality but with complete honesty, she was in love with him. She had been a scientist long enough to know that the moment of naming a thing was not the moment of its beginning. The name was just when you acknowledged what was already true. Washington was loud and gray and full of people who wanted things from her immediately, which was its own kind of culture shock after months in the high San Juans. Dr. Hale received her preliminary report with an excitement that he expressed in the limited vocabulary available to a senior Smithsonian official, which was to say he said it was extremely thorough and most promising, and scheduled a formal presentation for 3 weeks hence. The orchid was the centerpiece. Winifred had pressed and preserved 2 complete specimens and made detailed illustrations of a third before releasing it. And when the taxonomists at the Smithsonian examined her work, the consensus was that she had indeed found a previously unrecorded locality record for a species not known to occur in the San Juan range at that elevation, and that the ecological notes accompanying the specimen were unusually thorough. The guide's observations were helpful, she told Dr. Hale, when he asked about the field notes attributed to S. Lockhart. "Ah," said Dr. Hale, with the vague condescension of a man who assumed local guides were useful in the way that pack animals were useful. "Well, the main thing is your work. The observations are noted as his," Winifred said, "because they are his. They will be credited to him in the published report." Dr. Hale looked as though this were a slightly unusual request, but he agreed. She wrote to Seth. It was not an easy letter to write, because she was not accustomed to writing letters that dealt in the kind of material this one needed to deal in, namely, the honest description of what she was thinking and feeling in terms that were not botanical. But she wrote it, sitting at the desk in her small rented room in Georgetown with the winter rain on the window, and she said what was true, that she thought about the high country constantly, that she had presented the orchid findings and they had been well received, that she was working on the full report and it was going to be a substantial piece of work, and that she intended to propose to Dr. Hale a second survey the following spring, and that she hoped, very much, that he would be willing to serve as guide again. She also said, because she had not survived 4 years as a woman in a scientific institution by being indirect when directness served better, "I think about our conversations a great deal. I think about the last evening at the Aspen Grove. I am not certain that professional language is adequate to describe what I mean by that, but I expect you understand me." She sent the letter addressed to Seth Lockhart, to Michie Creek Valley, Gunnison County, Colorado Territory, and was not entirely sure it would reach him, but she sent it anyway. He wrote back in January. His handwriting was deliberate and careful, the handwriting of a man who did not write letters often, but who took the task seriously when he did. The letter was not long. It said that the fall trapping season had been good, that there had been significant snow in November, that he had reread Darwin over the winter and was thinking about what she had said about the flexibility of life, and that he was glad the orchid had been significant, because he had thought it looked like something unusual when he picked it up and was glad his instinct had been right. And then, at the end, in the same careful handwriting, "I have thought about our conversations also. I have thought about them considerably. The spring cannot come quickly enough." She read that last sentence 3 times, and then folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling jacket where she carried important documents. She proposed the second survey to Dr. Hale in February, and after a period of negotiation that required more energy than it should have, given that her first survey had been an unqualified scientific success, she prevailed. The second survey was approved, funded, and scheduled to begin in May 1879. She arrived in Gunnison on a Saturday morning in the first week of May, a year and a few days after her first arrival, with the same equipment trunks and the same focused energy, and the specific additional awareness that she was walking back into something that was both a professional assignment and an entirely personal matter, and the two were so thoroughly intertwined that she had given up trying to separate them. Seth was at the livery stable when she arrived, which was not where she had expected to find him, but Gunnison was a small town, and the livery was a place where men who worked with horses tended to gather. He was talking to the stable hand about something, and he looked up when she walked in, and his face did something. A brief, unguarded shift of expression that lasted perhaps a second before his habitual stillness returned. But it was enough. It was more than enough. He walked toward her and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle of the stable aisle and stood there, and she held out her hand, which was perhaps inadequate but was what the public situation permitted, and he took it, and the grip of his hand around hers was deliberate and warm and said considerably more than a handshake generally does. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she replied. "I know," he said. "But people say things." "I don't say things I don't mean," she told him. He looked at her for a moment, and the stable hand found something to do at the far end of the building, and Seth said quietly, "I know that too. It's one of the things I've been thinking about since October." They had dinner at the Pioneer House that evening at a corner table, and Mrs. Dole served them herself and found reasons to refill their coffee cups with great frequency. And what took place across that table was a conversation that covered 8 months in both directions. All the things that had happened, and all the things that had been thought, and all the ground between a letter sent in November and a letter received in January and a letter written back. And none of it was wasted time. At the end of dinner, when the dining room had mostly cleared and the lamps were burning low, Seth put his hands flat on the table, which she had learned was the thing he did when he was going to say something he had been thinking about carefully for some time. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I've been alone in that country for 8 years," he said. "I was satisfied with that. I thought that was what I was built for, the kind of solitude that comes from choosing to be in a place where most people won't follow." He looked at his hands. "You followed, and the satisfaction I'd had from the solitude became a kind of incompleteness in comparison. That's not a complaint, that's an observation." "What does the observation tell you?" she asked. He looked up at her. "That I would like, very much, if you would consider this more than a professional relationship going forward. That I would like to know that when the survey is done in July or August, the question of what comes next is one we're working on together." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because the moment warranted consideration. "Seth," she said, "I am a woman who has built a professional life in a world that did not particularly want her to have one. I am not willing to simply fold that life away. Whatever comes next has to include space for my work." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said, and the directness of it, the complete absence of qualification, made her believe him immediately and absolutely. "Then yes," she said. "Whatever comes next is something we work on together." He reached across the table and took her hand, right there in the Pioneer House dining room, with Mrs. Dole somewhere within earshot, and held it with the same deliberate warmth that had characterized everything he did when it counted. The second survey moved faster than the first and covered more ground, because they had the efficiency of 2 people who knew how to work together, and the additional efficiency of not having to establish from scratch what each of them was doing and why. They moved through the eastern slope of the San Juans in May, into the plateau country in June, and down to the Dolores River drainage in early July, and the plant life was different at each elevation and each longitude and each type of substrate, and Winifred filled 4 field journals where she had filled 2 the year before. Seth was better at the botanical work the second time, having spent 8 months thinking about the framework she had taught him, and the observations he contributed were sharper and more systematic. He began to notice not just individual plants but patterns, the way certain communities recurred, the indicators that told you something about the soil or the moisture regime of a site before you even got close enough to identify individual species. "You should write this down," she told him one afternoon, watching him describe a plant community on a mesa edge with a precision that her colleagues in Washington would have found impressive. "I'm not a scientist," he said. "You're making systematic observations and drawing logical inferences from them," she said. "That is what science is. The credentials come later." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as him processing something he had not yet integrated. "I'll think about it," he said. "Do," she said. That evening she gave him one of her spare field journals. He accepted it without a word and put it in his pack, and she did not mention it again, but she noticed that it was out on the camp table 2 mornings later with several pages filled. It was on a warm evening in late July, with the Dolores River audible beyond the cottonwoods below their camp, that Seth sat across the fire from her with that particular set of his jaw that she now knew meant a significant statement was incoming. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been doing that particular kind of thinking for 3 days." He looked slightly surprised that she could tell. "That obvious. You go very still," she said. "Even for you." He exhaled slowly. "When the survey ends," he said, "I don't want you to go back to Washington alone. I want to go with you." She blinked. "You want to go to Washington?" "I want to go wherever you're going," he said. "I know what I'm giving up here, and I know what I'm walking into, and I know it won't be easy. But I spent 8 years learning that solitude and peace are not the same thing. And this past year, the months between the surveys, the quiet was different. It was less like peace and more like absence." Her heart was doing that thing again, the elevated and irregular rhythm which she had entirely stopped trying to catalog. "Seth," she said carefully, "Washington is not the high country. It is loud and crowded and full of people who will not understand you immediately and some of whom will not understand you ever." "I'm not easy to understand," he agreed, without particular concern. "But I've been told I'm persistent." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had been her guide and her field partner and the most unexpected and necessary discovery of her scientific career, who read Darwin in blizzards and cooked trout with wild onions and carried 8 years of mountain solitude in the set of his shoulders and still, somehow, had been willing to open that solitude to her from the very first cup of coffee. "I need to finish the survey," she said, "and I need to write the second report. And then there is something else I need to do first." "What's that?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I need you to ask me something," she said. He understood her immediately. She had not doubted that he would. He stood up from his side of the fire and came around it and crouched down in front of her, which was as close to kneeling as his practical nature was going to get. And he took both her hands in his large, scarred, warm ones and looked at her with those gray stormwater eyes that she had been reading for 14 months and could now read as clearly as a field journal. "Winifred Prescott," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not because it is practical, because it is not especially practical, and not because I have everything figured out, because I do not. But because I am a better version of myself when you are in the same place, and because I think you might feel something similar, and because I have spent a considerable portion of the past year in a state that I can only describe as certainty about this particular thing." She looked at him for a moment, just one moment, taking in the entirety of him, the extraordinary solidness of him in every sense of the word, his hands around hers, the fire behind him, the river beyond the trees, the mountains somewhere to the east, dark against the stars. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He stood and pulled her up with him, and then his arms were around her, those powerful arms that had managed horses through blizzards and built fires in wind, and they held her with a care that was entirely disproportionate to the strength available, which was exactly as it should be. And she put her arms around him and held on. And the July night in the Dolores River Valley was warm and quiet and full of stars and the sound of water. They were married in Gunnison in September of 1879, at the church that had been finished by then, in a ceremony that was attended by Mrs. Dole and Mr. Holbrook and Cornelius Fitch, who turned out to be significantly more emotional at weddings than his daily demeanor would have suggested, and the Reverend Thomas Alcott, who married them with a seriousness that matched their own. Winifred wore a dress that was not white because she had not brought a white dress to Colorado Territory and did not intend to acquire one, but rather a deep blue wool that Mrs. Dole had helped her alter to fit properly, and she carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Seth had assembled himself from the hillside above town, and that included 3 species she had catalogued during the survey, which she found deeply appropriate. Seth wore his good shirt and his best coat, which he had purchased in Denver, and wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man in clothes that did not feel entirely like his own. But when she came down the church aisle toward him and he looked at her, the self-consciousness disappeared entirely, replaced by something so direct and focused that the people on either side of the aisle probably felt as though they were witnessing something slightly private. They said their vows with the same directness they brought to everything else, looking at each other without ceremony or performance, meaning every word. They spent their first nights as a married couple at the Pioneer House, where Mrs. Dole gave them the best room and prepared a dinner of uncommon ambition and genuine warmth. And they talked, late into the night, about the practicalities of what came next, because they were, both of them, fundamentally practical people who believed that love was real and planning was not incompatible with it. What they decided, after extensive discussion, was this: they would go to Washington together. Winifred needed to write the second survey report and deposit the second collection and attend to the professional obligations that could not be attended to remotely. Seth would come with her. He had never been to a city, and he was willing to be honest about the fact that this was going to be a significant adjustment. But he was not, he said, a man who ran from significant adjustments. They would stay in Washington through the winter, and then they would come back west. The Smithsonian, as it happened, had a further assignment for Winifred, a third survey in the spring of 1880 covering the basin and range country of the Arizona Territory, and she accepted it and proposed that her field guide from the first 2 surveys accompany her. And the Smithsonian's practical response to this was that if Seth Lockhart had produced the quality of field observations attributed to him in the first 2 reports, they were happy to extend a formal consulting agreement. Washington was, for Seth, exactly as difficult as they had both expected and exactly as navigable as his fundamental stubbornness permitted. He was out of place in the city in every visible way, too large, too quiet, too accustomed to space and silence to be comfortable in rooms full of talking. He managed. He did it in the way he managed everything, with the quiet persistence of a man who had decided something was necessary and therefore did not allow himself the option of retreat. He read, because there were more books in Washington than he had ever seen and most of them were available. And he read natural history and geology, and the accounts of Western exploration, and several volumes that Winifred recommended, and that he worked through with the focused attention he brought to all things. He made one friend, improbably, in the form of Winifred's colleague Dr. James Whitfield, a geologist of about 50 who had spent a decade doing field work in the West, and who recognized in Seth the particular quality of a man who knew the land from the inside, and who spent several evenings in conversation with him that Seth described to Winifred as useful. And Winifred's friend Margaret Astor met Seth at a dinner in November and wrote in her diary, which she shared with Winifred later, "He is the most purely attentive man I have ever encountered. He listens as though hearing matters. I understand now why Winifred's letters from the field sounded different. Winifred wrote the second survey report through the winter, working at the desk in the rooms they rented on P Street, and Seth sat on the other side of the room with his own journal or his current reading, and the two of them inhabited the same silence with the ease of people for whom shared silence has always been a form of communication. She submitted the report in February 1880. Dr. Hale called it the most comprehensive botanical survey document produced by this institution in the past decade. The orchid finding was published in a scientific journal, with attribution to Winifred Prescott as primary investigator and Seth Lockhart as contributing field observer, and she sent a copy to the Pioneer House in Gunnison for Mrs. Dole's considerable satisfaction. In March, they learned that Winifred was pregnant. She told Seth on a Sunday morning in their rooms on P Street, with the early March rain on the windows, having confirmed what she suspected for 2 weeks. She told him with the directness she brought to all significant information, stating the fact first and then waiting for his response. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from the chair he had been reading in and came to where she sat on the edge of the bed and sat beside her and took her hand in his and looked at her with the complete and focused attention that she had come to understand was his most fluent form of expression. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "And the Arizona survey?" "May is still 2 months out," she said. "I have spoken with Dr. Hale. He would prefer to proceed. There are female physicians in Tucson. I am not fragile, Seth." He looked at her for a long moment and she waited, knowing that he was working through something. "I will not tell you that you cannot do the work," he said at last. "I know better than to say that, and I know that it would not be right to say it even if I were less wise about it." He paused. "But I want you to know that my attention is going to be on you the whole time, even more than usual." "Even more than usual," she repeated, aware of what that meant given how attentive his usual attention was. "Yes," he said. "Is that acceptable?" She looked at him, this extraordinary man, sitting beside her on a rainy morning in Washington, with the information of an incoming life in the air between them, steady and serious, and caring in the most practical and genuine way. "It is completely acceptable," she said. They went to Arizona in May, and it was different from Colorado in every way that land can be different from other land. The heat, and the red rock and the enormous sky, and the desert plants that Winifred had not worked with before, and that required an entirely new framework of understanding because they played by completely different rules than alpine plants, all about water storage and root depth, and the timing of brief flowering after rare rain. She was fascinated and absorbed, and she worked hard through May and June, and Seth was with her every day. And if he positioned himself between her and the sun a great deal, and insisted on making camp earlier than strictly necessary, and checked the water supply with a vigilance that went beyond the merely professional, she accepted this as the language of care from a man who spoke in practical acts. They came back to Gunnison in August, because they had agreed that this was where they would be when the baby came, where there was a physician and Mrs. Dole's formidable competence, and the mountains they both understood. Their son was born in September 1880 in an upstairs room at the Pioneer House, with a physician named Dr. Clarence Marsh in attendance, and Mrs. Dole providing organizational authority that the doctor appeared to find simultaneously annoying and essential. The labor was long and difficult in the way of first labors, and Seth sat outside the door for 6 hours in a state that he would later describe as the most prolonged discomfort of his adult life, including the blizzard on Uncompahgre. When Dr. Marsh opened the door and told him he could come in, Seth crossed the room in 2 strides, and Winifred, exhausted and bright-eyed in the high-altitude way of women who have just done something enormous, held out the small wrapped person to him and said, "He is very loud, which I consider a promising characteristic." Seth took his son with the careful, exact grip of a man who handled fragile things seriously, and looked at him, and the look on his face was something Winifred committed to memory with the same precision she brought to her botanical illustrations, every detail, because she was not going to lose a single element of it. James, he said, because they had agreed on James, for the geologist friend in Washington who had been unexpectedly kind. James Arthur Lockhart, Winifred confirmed. Arthur for her father, the professor of classical languages who had taken her seriously when it mattered. They settled in the end, not in Washington and not entirely in the high country, but in a house in Gunnison that Seth built through the fall of 1880 with the same deliberate craftsmanship he brought to everything, solid and well-made, and designed for real life rather than appearances. It was not large, but it had a study for Winifred where she could work on her reports and illustrations, and a room that became the nursery, and a kitchen that Seth had opinions about because cooking mattered to him, and a porch that looked northeast toward the mountains. Seth continued to trap through the winters, shorter seasons now that came home to rather than ended in the cabin above Tamichi Creek, which he kept but no longer lived in. He took on guiding work for the survey teams that continued to come through Gunnison, as the territory was increasingly mapped and cataloged and studied, and his reputation in the Geological Survey's records grew to the point where his name appeared in 3 separate published survey reports as a field consultant, which he accepted without particular ceremony, but which Winifred noted with quiet, consistent pride. She continued to work. She wrote the Arizona report through the winter of 1880 and submitted it in the spring. She proposed and conducted a 4th survey, this one of the southern Rockies along the New Mexico border, in 1881, with James being minded by Mrs. Dole, who had by this point adopted the Lockhart family with the comprehensive efficiency she applied to all her projects. The 4th survey produced another significant finding, a population of a rare gentian species previously unrecorded in New Mexico, and the paper she published from it in the Proceedings of the American Association for the Advancement of Science was cited in 7 subsequent botanical publications over the following decade. Her reports and publications were read and discussed in Washington, and the resistance that had characterized her early career slowly, over years, gave way to something closer to recognition, which she accepted with the equanimity of a person who had always known the work was sound, and had simply waited for the world to catch up. She was formally acknowledged as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1884, and when the letter arrived, she read it at the kitchen table and Seth read it over her shoulder and said, "Good." It was past time, which was the most accurate and satisfying response she could have received from anyone. Their daughter, Eleanor, arrived in 1883, 2.5 years after James, and from her first hours was so different from her brother in temperament, quieter, more watchful, more inclined to observe than to announce, that Winifred looked at her in the first days and thought of cushion plants on alpine outcrops, perfectly adapted to their environment, everything exactly as it needed to be. James, at 3, was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, and had Seth's build beginning already, broad through the shoulders and sturdy, and he followed his father everywhere with the focused intention of a person who has identified their primary source of information and intends to extract all of it. Seth, who had grown up with a father of very few words, was deliberate about being different, answering every question James asked with the seriousness the question deserved, even when the question was why the sky was blue or whether bears could smell from very far away. The answers he gave were usually accurate because Seth Lockhart, who had left formal education at 14, had read enough in the intervening years that his working knowledge of natural history was substantial, and because for the questions he could not answer from knowledge he simply said, "I don't know. Let's find out," which Winifred considered the best possible answer. Eleanor, when she was old enough to form opinions, had her mother's precision and her father's patience, And she was the child who would eventually carry the field journals up to the high country meadows above Tamichi Creek when she was old enough to make that climb, and look at the cushion plants on the rock outcrops, and understand what she was looking at. But that was later. In the immediate years, in the house on the edge of Gunnison with the mountain view from the porch, what Winifred had was the particular texture of a life that had been built honestly by two people who had started from the same point of commitment to truth and had not deviated from it. Seth was not an easy man in the sense of being uncomplicated. He was serious and private and slow to let people in, and sometimes so focused on a thing that he forgot to communicate that he was thinking about it. She was not an easy woman in the sense of being uncomplicated. She was exacting and certain of herself, and liable to put her work before everything else, including occasionally sleep and comfort, and the signals of her own body that it was time to rest. They argued. Not often, but with the particular precision of two people who communicated clearly, and therefore communicated their disagreements clearly as well. They argued about the pace of her work and whether she was taking care of herself, and about the length of his winter trapping seasons, and whether 2 weeks away from the children was too long. These arguments were uncomfortable and necessary and always resolved, because neither of them was willing to leave things hanging, and both of them were better at listening than most. And in between the arguments and the work and the surveys and the children and the reports and the cold winters and the short brilliant summers, there were the evenings on the porch when the light fell across the mountain faces to the northeast and turned everything that particular shade of gold that only exists in the high country at that hour. And Seth would sit beside her in the other chair with his coffee, and the children would be inside, and the evening would be theirs for a few minutes. And she would look at the mountains and he would look at her looking at them, and neither of them would say anything, because, in the language they had developed over years, that particular silence meant everything good and nothing left undone. Gunnison changed around them over the years, grew larger and louder and more certain of its own permanence as the decade turned into the next. The railroad came in 1881, which changed everything in the practical sense of connecting the town to Denver and to the markets that had previously required weeks of supply wagon travel. New families arrived. New buildings went up. The church that had been framing when Winifred first arrived was full every Sunday by 1882. There were 2 schools and 3 hotels and a newspaper and a doctor's office that was not also someone's front room. Seth watched the town grow with the detached interest of a man who valued it for practical purposes and remained personally rooted in the country above it. He knew every trail and every drainage and every seasonal shift in the high San Juans as well as he had ever known them, and he continued to go up into that country with the regularity of a man visiting something essential, sometimes for work, sometimes simply because it was where he needed to be. Winifred never asked him to stop, because she understood it in the same way she understood that the orchid on the north-facing slope needed the conditions of that specific microhabitat, that the conditions were not incidental to the thing but constitutive of it. She went with him sometimes, when the children were old enough to be left with Mrs. Dole or with each other, James shepherding Alina with the same instinctive protectiveness that his father had always shown, and those days in the high country felt like returning to something that was foundational to the whole structure of their life together. One summer, when James was 8 and Alina was 5, they took both children up to the lower meadows above treeline, not the extreme high country but the gentle subalpine meadows where the wildflowers were extraordinary in July, and the air was cool, and the world felt cleaned of everything unnecessary. James ran ahead on the trail with the energy of a boy who had been born at altitude and could feel the difference when he was back in it. Alina walked beside Seth, holding his hand, her round face serious and attentive, watching the sides of the trail with her mother's noticing eyes. "Papa," Alina said, in the particular tone of a 5-year-old who has just seen something and requires information immediately, "what is that one?" She was pointing at a small cushion plant on a granite outcrop beside the trail, a tight rosette of small leaves with tiny white flowers, perfectly compact against the rock. Seth looked at it, and then he looked at Winifred, who had fallen into step beside him on the wider part of the trail, and she saw it in his face, the recognition, the memory of a different mountain afternoon years before. "Mama," he said, "you should answer this one." Winifred crouched down and looked at the plant and felt the particular joy that the natural world had always reliably produced in her, uncomplicated and genuine. "That," she said to a leaner, "is a saxifrage. It is small because it has to be small. The wind up here at altitude is too strong for a tall plant, so this one grows flat against the rock and saves all its energy for flowering. It is very strong in the way that things that have adapted perfectly to their conditions are always very strong." Alina considered this seriously. "It looks like it is holding on," she said. "It is," Winifred agreed. "That is exactly what it is doing." She straightened up and found Seth beside her, and his hand found hers and held it, and the four of them stood at the edge of the alpine meadow with the world spread out below them in its enormous and particular beauty, the valleys and the rivers and the distant blue ranges going on until they dissolved into sky. James came racing back from ahead on the trail, out of breath, and carrying something cupped in his hands that he was extremely excited about. "Mama," he announced, "I found a caterpillar and I need to know what kind." "Show me," she said, and he did, and she examined it with the magnifying glass she still carried in her jacket pocket on all mountain walks, because some habits were foundational and not to be set aside, and she told him it was a tiger moth caterpillar, Arctia species, common to these elevations, which he received with the gravity of a boy who was already keeping his own observation notebook, given to him by his father with the same wordless ceremony that Seth had received his first 1 year before. The afternoon was warm, and the meadow was full of flowers, and the sky was the specific blue that only exists at altitude, and Winifred stood in the middle of all of it, with her husband beside her and her children among the wildflowers, and felt the completeness of it in every part of herself, the scientist's satisfaction of a life built on genuine understanding, and the deeper satisfaction of a life built on genuine love. She had come to the San Juan country to catalog the wilderness. She had found everything she had expected to find there: the orchids and the cushion plants and the riparian zones, and the transitional forest communities, and the alpine meadows in their extraordinary compressed season generosity. She had filled 6 field journals and produced hundreds of illustrations, and published 7 significant scientific papers, and been recognized by her institution and her peers, and had contributed a piece of knowledge to the permanent accumulating record of what was known about this country and its plant life. And she had found, in the process of all of that, something she had not known she was looking for: a man who read Darwin in blizzards and cooked with wild onions and built fires in wind, and listened with the full attention of someone for whom hearing mattered, and who had looked at her from the edge of a forest in a high mountain valley and made her feel, for the first time in her precisely organized life, like the most interesting subject of study in the entire landscape. Seth, for his part, stood beside her in the meadow in the long afternoon light and watched his children among the flowers and his wife with her magnifying glass, and felt what he had felt on a February morning 13 years before, when he had come out of a mountain cabin before dawn and looked at the black sky full of stars and understood, for the first time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That feeling had never left. It had only grown, year by year and season by season, deeper and more certain, the way the roots of alpine plants grow down into the rock over decades, finding holds that no wind can shake loose, becoming so thoroughly part of the place that to remove them would be to change the place itself. He put his arm around Winifred's shoulders and she leaned into him, not because she needed support, but because she wanted to, and the distinction had always mattered to both of them, and they had always known it. "Alina wants to know everything about the saxifrage," she said, looking at their daughter, who had sat down cross-legged in front of the plant on the rock and was examining it with an expression of dedicated concentration. "She learned that from you," he said. "She learned that from the both of us," Winifred said. "You've been bringing her plants since she was old enough to hold one without crushing it." "True," he said. James came back again with something else in his hands, less dramatically this time, and said, "Papa, what's a good campsite from here? Can we come up and camp sometime?" Seth looked at his son, at the height of him and the build of him and the particular way he stood, feet planted and chin up, and said, "Next summer. You'll be old enough to carry a real pack by then." "I can carry a pack now," James said. "Next summer," Seth said, without negotiation, because some things did not require debate. James accepted this in the way he accepted most of his father's determinations, with the minimal resistance of a boy who had learned that certain things were final, and that finality from this source was not arbitrary, but was always, ultimately, correct. They made their way back down the trail as the afternoon light began its long westward lean, the mountains going gold to the east and purple to the west, and the children ran ahead and then waited and ran ahead again in the specific rhythm of children who are happy and have no reason to hurry. And Seth and Winifred walked together in the particular comfortable silence that had been their most fluent language since the first evening by a fire in the high San Juans, when they had both stopped pretending the silence was merely professional. The town appeared below them as they descended, the buildings catching the last light, the smoke of early cooking fires rising, the sound of Gunnison's evening beginning to carry up the trail, voices and horses, and the far bell of the church. Home, in all its complicated and beloved reality. She had come to catalog the wilderness, and she had done that, rigorously and with lasting scientific value, and the wilderness had given her back more than she had brought to it: a husband and a family, and a life that was larger and more various than anything her precisely organized younger self could have designed. The most surprising discovery of her career, of her life, had not been the orchid at the spring seep, or the saxifrage on the granite outcrop, or any of the 7 documented botanical firsts that her published papers recorded. It had been Seth Lockhart, standing at the edge of the forest in the high mountain valley, watching her come up the trail with the same direct, assessing attention he would give to weather or to water, and deciding on the basis of a Smithsonian letter, and whatever else he had read in her bearing and her eyes, that she was worth his time and his country and eventually everything else. She had been worth it. She had made very sure of that every year since. And he had been worth every impractical mile. They came down off the mountain as the stars were beginning, James with his observation notebook tucked under his arm and a leaner asleep against Seth's broad shoulder, carried with the same careful strength that characterized everything he did when it mattered. And Winifred walked beside them with her magnifying glass in her pocket and her mind full of the day's observations and her heart completely, unreservedly full of this, all of this. The particular irreplaceable texture of a life that had been built on honesty and work, and the willingness to recognize something genuine when it appeared at the edge of a forest and looked directly at you. The lights of Gunnison came on one by one below them as the dark came down, and the mountains rose behind, and the night was clear and enormous and full of stars, and everything, at last and completely, was as it should be.